Nobody warned them. That was the first problem. The second problem was the way they laughed. It was a Tuesday morning in London. The kind of morning where the sky is the color of old silver and the air smells like rain that hasn't fallen yet. Tourists pour through the iron gates of Buckingham Palace like water, finding every gap, cameras raised. Voices loud, sneakers squeaking on the wet stone path. Among them was a group of 4. 2 men, 2 women. They were somewhere in their mid-30s, dressed in bright jackets and holiday smiles. They had flown in from overseas the night before. This was their first full day in London. They had a list: the palace, the tower, the bridge. The whole dream. They didn't know that some dreams come with rules. The royal guard stood at his post like he was carved from stone. Red tunic, black bearskin hat, white-gloved hands gripping his rifle. His eyes didn't move. His face didn't twitch. He stared straight ahead into a point that didn't exist, the way soldiers are trained to look through the world, not at it. The group noticed him immediately. One of the men, tall, with a camera hanging around his neck, nudged his friend and pointed. They moved closer, then closer. The way people move toward something they don't fully understand. Pulled by curiosity and the quiet arrogance of thinking nothing can go wrong. If you've never heard of this channel before, this is the kind of story we tell here. Real moments, real consequences. If this speaks to you, hit subscribe before this story ends. Because what happens next is something you won't want to miss. The man with the camera stopped just a few feet from the guard. He tilted his head, studying him like an exhibit. Then he grinned, turned to his group, and said something that made them all burst into laughter. He had called the guard a statue. Not quietly, not under his breath, loud enough for the people around them to hear, loud enough to echo slightly off the stone wall behind the sentry box. The guard didn't react, not even a flicker behind his eyes. He had been trained for this: taunts, laughter, people waving hands in front of his face. He had stood through all of it before. His job was to hold the line, not just physically, but in every other way a person can hold a line. But one of the women in the group wasn't done. She stepped forward. She was smiling the way someone smiles when they think they're being playful, when they don't realize they're being something else entirely. She reached out slowly at first, like she was testing the air between them, and then she touched the barrel of his rifle. Just a tap. That's all it was, but a tap on a ceremonial rifle held by a soldier of the crown is not a small thing. The air around them seemed to change. Other tourists nearby stopped walking. A few looked away, instinctively uncomfortable. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve. Even the wind seemed to pause. The guard's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough for someone watching closely to catch it. His eyes shifted 1 degree. No more, and settled on the middle distance with new intensity, and then, from somewhere to the left, came the sound of boots on stone. Steady, purposeful, getting louder. A figure in a different uniform was moving through the crowd, not running, not shouting, just walking the way someone walks when they have all the authority in the world and they know it. Asterisk, asterisk, his name was Officer Daniel Marsh. He was 43 years old. 21 of those years had been spent in the Metropolitan Police. He had worked crowds at state funerals. He had stood at barriers when world leaders passed through. He had seen every kind of tourist, the curious ones, the careless ones, and the ones who didn't know the difference between a landmark and a human being. He knew which kind he was looking at now. He moved through the crowd with the calm of a man who had done this many times. People parted without being asked. Something about his posture made them step aside, straight back, steady eyes, hands loose at his sides. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't need to be. He wore his authority the way the guard wore his uniform. Without apology, he stopped 2 steps from the group. "Excuse me?" His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words landed cleanly in the space between them. And the 4 tourists turned around with expressions that ranged from startled to slightly defensive. The way people look when they know, somewhere in the back of their minds, that they've crossed a line. The woman who had touched the rifle pulled her hand back. Not quickly. Slowly, the way you move when you're trying to pretend you weren't doing anything. Officer Marsh looked at her. Then at the rifle. Then back at her. "You touched the weapon," he said. Not a question. She blinked. It was just a little tap." "I didn't mean I understand," he said. And he said it in a way that made it very clear he didn't mean it the way she hoped. He looked at all 4 of them now. His gaze moved from face to face, the way a teacher's does when addressing the whole class, not just the one who misbehaved. "These soldiers are on active ceremonial duty," he said. "They are not a tourist attraction. They are not props for photographs. They are members of the British Armed Forces, and the area you are standing in has specific rules of conduct." The tall man with the camera lowered it slightly. "We didn't know there are signs," Officer Marsh said. Quiet, firm. At the entrance, in 4 languages, silence. Somewhere nearby, a tour group shuffled past. A child pointed at the guard and whispered something to her father, who hushed her and moved her along quickly. The 4 tourists stood very still now. The laughter from 2 minutes ago felt like it belonged to a different day. Officer Marsh reached into his vest and produced a small news identification card. He held it forward, not threateningly, just visibly. A formality. A signal that this conversation was official. "I'm going to need to ask you to step away from this area," he said. "I'll also need to take your names and the name of your accommodation. This will be logged." The woman's face shifted. "Logged? We're not. We didn't do anything criminal." "No," he agreed. "You didn't. But what you did was disrespectful to a serving soldier, and it was a breach of the visitor conduct guidelines for this site." He paused. "We take that seriously here." The tall man glanced at his friends. Something unspoken passed between them, a look of recalibration. The kind that happens when a situation you thought was minor suddenly has weight to it. "Where do you need us to go?" he asked. "With me," Officer Marsh said. "Just over here." He gestured toward a small area to the side, away from the crowd. Clear, visible. Somewhere the conversation could happen without spectacle, because Officer Marsh wasn't interested in spectacle. He was interested in something else. As the group followed him, one of them glanced back at the Royal Guard. The guard hadn't moved, not an inch, not a muscle. But if you looked closely, and only if you looked very closely, might have noticed that the line of his shoulders had eased, just slightly. The way a person's body relaxes when someone they trust has stepped in. "What officer?" Marsh said to them next, away from the crowd, away from the cameras, was something none of the 4 tourists expected. It didn't begin with a warning, it began with a story. Asterisk, asterisk officer. Marsh didn't pull out a notepad right away. He stood with them in the side area. A quieter stretch of pavement near a low iron fence. Away from the foot traffic, and he looked at each of them in turn, not with anger. With something harder to read than anger. "The soldier you were laughing at," he began. "His name is not something I'll share. But I'll tell you something about him." The group was quiet. The woman who had touched the rifle folded her arms, not defensively this time, but the way people do when they're bracing themselves. He enlisted at 18. He served 2 overseas deployments before he was 25. He lost someone close to him on the second one. A friend. Someone he trained with, ate with, shared a tent with for months. Officer Marsh paused. He came back. His friend didn't. No one said anything. He stands at that post 6 days a week. In the cold, in the heat. Through the noise and the crowds and the people who think it's funny to wave in his face or call him a statue, he let that word sit in the air for a moment. He doesn't react. Not because he can't feel it, but because his duty requires something most people will never be asked to give: total control, total discipline, total presence, every single day. The tall man with the camera had lowered it completely now. It hung at his side, forgotten. "We really didn't know," one of the other men said. His voice was quieter than it had been before. "I mean, we saw him standing there, and we thought you thought he was part of the scenery," Officer Marsh said, not unkindly. Just directly, the man nodded slowly. That was exactly what they had thought, and hearing it said aloud made it land differently. Officer Marsh reached into his vest again. This time, he did take out a small notebook. He uncapped a pen and looked at them. Names and your hotel or rental address. They gave their names without protest. 4 of them, one by one. He wrote carefully, said each name back to confirm the spelling. It was routine, but the routine itself felt significant. The act of being recorded, of existing in an official account of the morning. "Are we going to be fined?" the woman asked. "Not today," he said. "The physical contact with the weapon, that's the most serious element. In certain circumstances, it can lead to a formal caution. Today, given that it was brief and you weren't warned beforehand in person, I'm recording it as an advisory incident." He looked at her directly. "But if anything similar happens again, anywhere in this vicinity, it won't be treated the same way." She nodded. Her eyes had gone glassy, not from tears exactly, but from the particular discomfort of being seen. Officer Marsh clicked the pen closed. "Enjoy the rest of your visit," he said. "London is worth seeing properly." He turned to go, but the tall man spoke up. Officer Marsh stopped, turned back. "What you told us about the soldier, was that true? Or did you say it to make a point?" Officer Marsh considered the question. He wasn't offended by it. It was, actually, a decent question. An honest one. "Does it matter?" he said. The man thought about that, then slowly shook his head. "No, I suppose it doesn't." Marsh gave a single nod and walked back toward the gate. He had taken maybe 20 steps when he heard it. Behind him, faint but unmistakable. A camera shutter. He stopped walking. Then came a burst of laughter. Different voices, and a voice that carried male, young accent he couldn't quite place, saying something in the direction of the guard's sentry box. He turned around. It wasn't the same group. It was someone else entirely. And this time, they weren't just laughing. Asterisk, asterisk, there were 3 of them. Young men, early 20s, baseball caps, and loud voices. They were recording on their phones. Not casually, the way tourists do, but deliberately, the way people do when they want an audience. One of them had stepped directly in front of the guard's sentry box, not beside it. In front of it, he was making faces, exaggerated, mocking expressions, widening his eyes, puffing out his cheeks, all while his friend recorded. And the third one laughed so hard, he bent at the waist. The royal guard stood without expression, but his breathing had changed, slow, controlled, deliberate. The kind of breathing that takes practice. The kind that means something is being held back. Officer Marsh was already moving. This time, his pace was different, faster, purposeful in a new way, the kind of stride that has a destination and no interest in obstacles. The crowd seemed to sense it. People stepped aside without being asked, almost instinctively, the way you move away from something with momentum. He reached the 3 young men in seconds. "Step away from the post." His voice was different now. Still controlled, but stripped of the gentleness he'd used with the first group. This was the version of his voice that came from 21 years. Of knowing exactly how much warning a situation deserved. The young man in front of the sentry box turned around. He was grinning, The grin of someone who thinks he's performing and hasn't realized the audience has changed. "Relax, mate. We're just having a laugh." "Step away from the post," Marsh repeated. Same tone, same pace, like a wall that doesn't move because it doesn't need to. The grin flickered. One of the friends lowered his phone slightly. He'd read the room faster than the others. He took a small step back, almost without realizing it. "You can't just," the young man started. "I can," Marsh said. "And I am. Move. Now." Something in the delivery of those two words, flat, certain, carrying no trace of negotiation, made the young man's posture shift. The performance drained out of him the way air leaves a balloon. He stepped to the side. Marsh positioned himself between them and the sentry box. He didn't touch anyone. He didn't raise his voice again. He simply stood there, and his presence alone rewrote the geography of the situation. He looked at all three of them. "You're being removed from this area. You'll come with me and you'll do it without a scene." Removed. The third one, the one who'd been laughing, had stopped laughing now. Like, actually removed from a public space. "This is Crown property," Marsh said, "and you have been disrupting the duties of a serving soldier. That is not a gray area." The one with the phone glanced at his screen, still recording, and Marsh looked at it calmly. "You can keep recording," he said. "Everything I'm doing is by the book. And everything you did is now also on record." He paused just long enough. "All three phones will have captured your faces clearly. That's helpful for us." The phone lowered. Marsh led them away. Unlike the first group, these three were quieter. Not with the quiet of reflection, but with the quiet of people recalibrating very quickly. They walked without argument, without protest, as they passed the sentry box. One of them, the one who had been making the faces, glanced at the guard. The guard was looking straight ahead, as he always did, as he was trained to do. But the young man paused. Just for a moment, something moved across his face, hard to name, harder to ignore. Not quite guilt, not quite shame, something in between. It's a kind of feeling that doesn't have a word but leaves a mark. Marsh brought them to the checkpoint near the gate. He was calm, professional. He took their details, explained the process, outlined the formal warning they would each receive in writing, and then he told them something. Not about protocol, not about the law. He told them about the morning, about the first group and what he'd said to them. About the soldier who never moves and why. About the weight that a person carries when they've chosen to stand between ceremony and chaos, between dignity and disrespect every single day. One of the young men was looking at the ground by the time Marsh finished. The one with the phone hadn't opened it again, and the one who had stood in front of the sentry box, the one who had grinned and thought it was funny, was staring back toward the gate with an expression no one would want to photograph. The morning was almost over, but Officer Marsh wasn't done, because what he found when he returned to the post, what he saw when he got close enough, stopped him in a way that nothing else that day had. Asterisk, asterisk. The crowd had thinned around the sentry box. After everything that had happened, the first group, then the second, the atmosphere near that corner of the palace had changed. People moved past it more carefully now. A few tourists had watched the confrontations from a distance, and something had settled over the area. A kind of quiet that felt earned. Officer Marsh walked back toward the post. He wasn't sure what made him look closely. Maybe it was the slight wrongness of it. Something in the air that wasn't there before. The way a room feels different when a window has been left open. The guard was still in position, still upright, still staring forward. But there was something on the ground, beside the sentry box. A small object, dark, partially hidden by the shadow of the box. Marsh stepped closer. It was a phone. cracked phone, face down on the stone. It must have fallen or been dropped sometime during the chaos of the second group. He crouched and looked at it without touching it. The screen was shattered but still lit. He stood and looked at the guard, and that was when it happened. The guard blinked. Not unusually, people blink. But then his eyes shifted, fractionally, almost nothing. But they moved just slightly. Toward Officer Marsh. It was the most movement Marsh had seen from him all morning. Marsh stayed still. He understood immediately. This was not an invitation to conversation. The guard wasn't breaking protocol. He was communicating within the limits of what protocol allowed, which was almost nothing, but not quite nothing. Marsh looked back at the phone, then at the guard. Then he nodded once and stepped away to radio in a lost property report. It was a small moment, almost invisible. And yet it sat with Marsh differently than anything else that had happened that morning. He had spent the day dealing with people who looked at the guard and saw a prop, a statue, a punchline. And here was the man himself, immovable, silent, trained to give nothing away, and yet in the span of 2 seconds, he had communicated something. Clearly, quietly, humanly. Marsh filed the report and returned to his patrol. An hour later, the shift at the sentry box changed. The guard, who had stood there all morning through the laughter, through the touching, through the faces and the phones, marched away in formation with the same discipline he had arrived with. Back straight, eyes forward, rifle steady. No acknowledgement of the morning. No visible exhaustion. No sign that anything unusual had happened at all. Marsh watched him go. He thought about what he'd told both groups that morning. The story of the soldier, the deployments, the friend who didn't come home. It didn't matter, he had said, whether it was true or not. But here was the truth of it. He had used that story many times. On days like this one, with tourists from a dozen different countries who had made the same mistake in 100 different ways. He used it because it worked, because it reminded people that a uniform is not a costume. He had never actually spoken to the guard about it. He didn't know his name, not really. He didn't know his history, but he knew what he had seen that morning. A man who held himself together when other people tried to take him apart, who stood still in the face of mockery, who held a line, not with force, but with something rarer. Dignity. The crowd moved on. New tourists arrived. New phones raised. New voices filling the space where the laughter had been. And at the sentry box, a new guard took his position. Red tunic, black bearskin, eyes straight ahead. The morning had already been forgotten by most of the people who'd been part of it. The first group were probably on their way to the tower by now. The second group were likely on their phones, uploading something, maybe not the footage from the palace, maybe something else, maybe nothing at all. But for Officer Daniel Marsh, the morning hadn't quite ended. Because before he finished his shift, he received a message from a number he didn't recognize. And what it said made him stand completely still in the middle of a moving crowd. Asterisk. Asterisk. The message was 3 sentences long. Marsh read it twice, then a third time. Then he stood there on the pavement outside the gate. The city moving around him, taxis, pigeons, the sound of a busker somewhere down the road, and he felt the kind of stillness that comes when something unexpected lands exactly right. The message said, "I was watching this morning. What you did mattered. Thank you for the story. I needed someone to tell it. No name, no context." Just those 3 lines and a number he didn't know. He thought for a long time about who might have sent it. A tourist who had watched from a distance. One of the first group, the woman maybe, who had looked so uncomfortable when he said they treated the guard like scenery. One of the second group, the one who had stared back at the gate with that expression no one would want to photograph. He didn't reply. Not immediately. He stood and thought about it, And the longer he thought, the less it mattered who had sent it. Because the point wasn't the message. The point was the morning marsh had been doing this job long enough to know that most of what you do in a day disappears the moment it's done. Reports get filed and forgotten. Warnings get issued and ignored. People move through a city and leave no trace. That's the nature of it. You do your job and the world keeps moving. And you go home. But occasionally, not often, not as often as it should be, something lands. Something reaches a person at the right moment, in the right way, and it changes the way they see something. Not dramatically. Not permanently, maybe, but enough. The story he told that morning about the soldier, about duty, about the friend who didn't come home, was not his own. He had pieced it together over years from fragments of real things. Conversations in back rooms. Officers who had served, veterans who had stood where that guard stood and carried. More than anyone watching them could see, it was not one man's story. It was the story of all of them. Every person who had ever stood in stillness while the world moved noisily around them. Who had held a line not with aggression, but with an absolute refusal to abandon their post. He typed back 2 words, "Thank you." Then he pocketed his phone and finished his patrol. Later that week, a video appeared online. It had been posted by one of the tourists from the second group, not the footage from in front of the sentry box, which was never shared. Something different. A short clip, shot from a distance, of Officer Marsh walking toward the group with that calm, purposeful stride. No audio. Just the image of a man moving through a crowd. With complete certainty. The caption read, "This officer handled something perfectly today. No shouting. No drama. Just quiet authority. London, I respect you." It had over 400,000 views in 48 hours. The comments were full of people asking what had happened. Wanting to know the story behind the clip. Wanting to understand what quiet authority looks like when it's practiced by someone who has earned it. Officer Marsh never saw the video. He wasn't on social media, and the Royal Guard, whoever he was, whatever he carried, wherever he'd been before, he stood at that post, never saw it either. He was already back at his position the next morning. Red tunic, black bearskin, eyes straight ahead, still, silent, immovable, doing what he had always done, standing so that others didn't have to understand what standing costs. And somewhere in the city, for tourists were telling the story to someone else. Getting it wrong in places, probably. Getting the emotion right. That's how some lessons travel. Not through punishment, not through shame, through the right person at the right moment. Saying the right thing and walking away before anyone can thank them.